January 1941, Beirut, Lebanon. Naftali Lubenchik, a representative of a small Jewish underground group, sat down with German Foreign Ministry official Werner Otto von Hentig in a meeting that would become one of the most controversial episodes in the history of the Zionist movement. Lubenchik came with an extraordinary proposal. His organization, Lehi, would actively fight Britain on Germany's side in exchange for German support in creating a Jewish state in Palestine. This wasn't a rogue operative acting alone. He carried the full authorization of Lehi's founder, Avraham Stern, a Polish-born intellectual who believed that tactical cooperation with Nazi Germany was the only way to expel Britain from Palestine and save European Jews through mass immigration. The common assumption is that all Jewish groups during World War II fought against Hitler. This episode reveals how one extremist faction viewed Britain as its primary enemy and considered Nazi Germany a potential tactical partner. But what happened to Stern's proposal, and how did this decision shape the violent final years of British rule in Palestine? To understand how a Jewish leader could propose allying with Nazi Germany in 1941, the background of Avraham Stern and the split that created Lehi provides essential context. Stern was born in December 1907 in Suwałki, Poland, which was then under Russian control, and during World War I his mother fled with him and his brother as German forces advanced. He immigrated to Palestine in 1925 and studied classical languages and literature at Hebrew University, where he focused on Greek and Latin, and he later won a scholarship to study in Florence, Italy, where he dove deep into European poetry and political thought. When he returned to Palestine, he joined the Irgun, a militant Zionist group that had split from the mainstream Haganah in 1931 over the question of using force against both British authorities and Arab populations. Stern moved up through Irgun's ranks and became known for his poetry as much as his military activities, with his poems expressing an almost mystical devotion to the Jewish homeland and to dying for it, which one analyst described as combining an obsession with death alongside a complete rejection of romantic relationships with women. His poem, Unknown Soldiers, became an anthem for the underground, celebrating Jews who would die fighting in the streets for their homeland rather than wandering in exile, and Stern's poetry was heavily influenced by Russian and Polish writers, especially Vladimir Mayakovsky, creating a cult of revolutionary sacrifice that would define Lehi's ideology. The crisis came in 1939 when Britain issued the White Paper, which severely restricted Jewish immigration to Palestine by allowing only 75,000 Jews to enter over 5 years, and blocking any further immigration after that unless local Arabs gave permission. For Zionists who saw Palestine as a refuge for persecuted European Jews, this was a catastrophic betrayal, and the timing made it worse because in 1939 Jews were fleeing Nazi persecution in growing numbers, while Britain was effectively closing the door to their main potential refuge. Different Zionist groups responded to this crisis in different ways, based on what they thought was the bigger threat and which enemy should be the priority. When World War II began in September 1939, the Irgun's supreme commander, Ze'ev Jabotinsky, made a critical decision. He declared that fighting Nazi Germany was more important than fighting Britain, so the Irgun would stop its underground operations against British authorities for the duration of the war. Jabotinsky believed that Britain, despite the White Paper, was still better than Nazi Germany, and that Jews should support Britain in defeating Hitler. The mainstream Haganah took the same position, with many members even joining the British Army to fight the Nazis. Avraham Stern strongly disagreed. In August 1940, shortly after his release from British detention, Stern broke away from the Irgun and formed his own group. Initially called the National Military Organization in Israel, it took the name Lehi in September 1940. Lehi is a Hebrew acronym for Lohamei Harut Israel, meaning fighters for the freedom of Israel. The British called it the Stern Gang. Stern's position was uncompromising. The struggle against Britain must continue regardless of the World War. He believed that cooperating with Britain, even to fight Hitler, was a fundamental betrayal of the Zionist cause. For Stern, Britain was preventing the creation of a Jewish state and blocking Jewish refugees from reaching safety in Palestine. That made Britain the main enemy, not Germany. Stern's thinking was based on a distinction he made between what he called enemies of the Jewish people and Jew haters, with Britain falling into the first category because it actively blocked the creation of a Jewish state and stopped Jewish immigration to Palestine, while the Nazis fell into the second category as people who wanted Germany to be free of Jews. This distinction led Stern to a tactical calculation that shocked mainstream Zionists, based on the reasoning that if the Nazis wanted Jews out of Europe and the Zionists wanted Jews in Palestine, these goals could potentially line up, and if Britain was preventing both Nazi Germany and the Zionists from getting what they wanted, cooperation against Britain might serve both sides. This reasoning overlooked fundamental moral reality realities that most people, even in 1940, could see clearly, given that the Nazis weren't just encouraging emigration but were persecuting Jews with increasing brutality. Kristallnacht had happened in November 1938, and Jews in Germany and occupied territories faced systematic discrimination, violence, and loss of property, while the creation of ghettos had begun in Poland by 1940. The full scale of the Holocaust hadn't emerged yet, and the final solution wouldn't be put into action until 1942, but the evidence of Nazi brutality toward Jews was already overwhelming and widely known by the time Stern made his proposal. Stern chose to overlook this evidence because he believed the tactical opportunity was more important than moral considerations. Based on his writings and actions during this period, Stern appears to have convinced himself that Hitler wanted to make Germany Judenrein through emigration rather than extermination. From this perspective, a deal could be struck. Germany would allow Jews to leave for Palestine, and Lehi would help Germany defeat Britain in the Middle East. This would solve what both sides called the Jewish problem, while getting Lehi what it wanted, which was a Jewish state. Stern even believed Germany might provide military support for a Lehi-led takeover of Palestine from the British. In late 1940, Stern put this theory into practice. He sent Naftali Lubenchik to Beirut, which was then under Vichy French control, to make contact with German officials. Lebanon's position made it accessible to German diplomatic and intelligence personnel who couldn't operate in British-controlled Palestine. Lubenchik's mission was to propose a formal alliance between Lehi and Nazi Germany. The meeting took place in January 1941 with Werner Otto von Hentig, a German foreign ministry representative who had also been involved with the Havarah Agreement, which since 1933 had been transferring German Jews and their property to Palestine. During the meeting, Lubenchik explained Lehi's position and capabilities by telling von Hentig that Lehi hadn't yet shown its full power and could organize a wide range of anti-British operations, and the proposal he presented was based on a straightforward exchange in which Lehi would support sabotage and spy operations in the Middle East and Eastern Europe on Germany's behalf in return for German recognition of an independent Jewish state in Palestine and help transferring European Jews there. Based on the proposal's structure, Stern appears to have calculated that this arrangement would serve both German and Lehi interests, with Germany gaining an ally fighting Britain in a strategically important region, while Lehi would gain the outside support needed to kick Britain out and establish a state that could take in European Jewish refugees. The proposal went beyond tactical cooperation, as shown by the document that came out of these discussions, known as the Ankara Document, because it was later found in German embassy files in Ankara. Lehi offered to actively take part in the war on Germany's side in return for German support for the establishment of the historic Jewish state on a national and totalitarian basis, bound by a treaty with the German Reich. The use of the word totalitarian was deliberate rather than accidental, showing that Stern's Lehi wasn't proposing a democratic state, but an authoritarian regime organized along principles similar to fascist state, which would make Lehi's Jewish state compatible with the German-dominated new order in Europe that Hitler was trying to create. Stern also proposed recruiting 40,000 Jews from Nazi-occupied Europe to form a Jewish army that would invade Palestine with German military support. This force would kick out the British and establish Lehi's control over the territory. The proposal imagined German transport ships or aircraft bringing trained Jewish fighters from Europe to Palestine, where they would fight Britain with German weapons and backing. For Stern, this wasn't collaborating with an enemy, but tactical cooperation with a power that shared his immediate goal of defeating Britain. On January 11, 1941, Vice Admiral Ralph von der Marwitz, the German naval attaché in Turkey, filed a report conveying Lehi's offer, and according to historian Joseph Heller, the memorandum was an entirely authentic document bearing the stamp of the organization. Von der Marwitz delivered the offer, classified as secret, to the German ambassador in Turkey, and on January 21, 1941, the document was forwarded to Berlin for consideration by German authorities, after which no response ever came from Germany, with no acknowledgement, no negotiation, and no counter-offer, as the proposal simply disappeared into the German bureaucracy without producing any reaction. Why Germany ignored Lehi's offer can be explained by several factors. First, by January 1941, Germany had no strategic need for a Jewish ally in Palestine, given that German forces weren't yet in the Middle East and Britain still controlled the region firmly. A small underground group's promise to fight Britain held little value compared to Germany's existing relationships with Arab leaders who opposed both Britain and Zionism. Especially since the Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, had met with Hitler and offered Arab support for the Axis cause, making Germany see far more value in building up Arab nationalism than in supporting a Jewish state. Second, the proposal contradicted fundamental Nazi ideology. However, Stern tried to frame it: the idea of Germany helping create a Jewish state, even a totalitarian one, ran counter to Nazi racial theories and their ultimate goals for the Jewish people. The Nazi leadership saw Jews as racial enemies, not potential allies. The language about Jew haters versus enemies of the Jewish people meant nothing to Germans who saw Jews as both. By 1941, Nazi policy was moving toward the extermination that Stern convinced himself wasn't coming. Third, the practical obstacles were overwhelming. Even if Germany had wanted to help Lehi, how would they transfer 40,000 Jewish fighters to Palestine? How would they supply an invasion force through British-controlled waters and airspace? How would they make sure Lehi stayed loyal once a Jewish state existed? The entire proposal depended on assumptions about German capabilities and intentions that had no basis in reality. German officials who reviewed the document likely saw it as unrealistic fantasy from a desperate group with no real power. Stern didn't give up after the first attempt failed. In late 1941, he sent another messenger, Nathan Yellin Moore, to make contact with German representatives. This time the mission didn't even reach the meeting stage. British authorities arrested Yellin Moore in Syria before he could travel to Beirut. This ended Lehi's attempts to forge a Nazi alliance. Not because Stern gave up on the idea, but because circumstances made further contact impossible. The Nazi proposal cost Lehi heavily, among other Zionist groups. The mainstream Jewish community in Palestine, known as the Yishuv, had already viewed Stern's group with suspicion and hostility for continuing to fight Britain during the war. When word leaked about the Nazi contact, that suspicion turned to disgust. The Haganah, which represented the majority of the Yishuv, condemned Lehi's actions as morally awful and tactically insane. The Jewish Agency, the organization representing Jewish interests to Britain, viewed Stern as a dangerous extremist whose actions threatened the entire Zionist project. Even within revisionist Zionism, the militant branch of the movement that Stern came from, the Nazi proposal generated intense criticism. Zeev Jabotinsky, who had died in August 1940, had wanted Britain to defeat the Nazis even while pushing for the end of British control of Palestine. Stern's willingness to work with Hitler's regime violated fundamental principles that even hardline revisionists held. Many Irgun members who had initially respected Stern's dedication now saw him as having crossed a line that couldn't be forgiven. The British used Lehi's Nazi contacts to further damage the group's reputation. British authorities had already been hunting Stern intensely for Lehi's bank robberies and attacks on British police. Now they could label him not just a terrorist but a Nazi collaborator. This made it politically easier for Britain to use harsh measures against Lehi while claiming they were fighting a group that had sided with Hitler. The British increased the price on Stern's head and intensified operations to capture him. Throughout 1941, British police closed in on Lehi's network. The group's small size, probably fewer than 200 active members, made it vulnerable to infiltration and surveillance. Lehi members were arrested in a series of raids, with some killed in shootouts and others imprisoned. Stern himself went into hiding, moving between safe houses in Tel Aviv and constantly staying one step ahead of British detectives. The pressure was enormous, disrupting Lehi's operations and making funding from bank robberies increasingly difficult as police presence increased. Recruiting new members became nearly impossible when the group's reputation had been destroyed by the Nazi contact story. By early 1942, Stern was isolated and desperate, as most of his lieutenants were dead or in British custody, and the organization he had built was on the verge of collapse, while the British had tracked his movements and were closing the circle around his hiding places. On February 12, 1942, British police received information that Stern was hiding in an apartment in the Florentine neighborhood of Tel Aviv, and a team of British detectives raided the apartment early that morning, initially not finding Stern until one officer, checking a closet, thrust his hand through hanging clothes and touched flesh, at which point Stern was pulled out from his hiding place. What happened next remains disputed to this day. The official British version, provided by Assistant Superintendent Geoffrey Morton, who led the raid, claimed that Stern tried to escape by lunging toward a window. According to Morton, he shot Stern as he was halfway out the window because he believed Stern might be reaching for a weapon or explosive device. The British report stated that Stern was shot while trying to flee, characterizing this as legitimate use of force against a dangerous fugitive. But Lehi members and witnesses told a completely different story. According to Tova Svorai, who was in the apartment, Stern was pulled from the closet and made to sit on a sofa. British officers handcuffed his hands behind his back and then ordered everyone else in the apartment to leave and go downstairs. As soon as they exited, they heard 3 shots. Tova Svorai and other Lehi members who later investigated the incident believed Stern was shot in cold blood while handcuffed and helpless. Bernard Stamp, one of the British policemen present, said in a 1986 interview broadcast on Israel Radio that Morton's account was hogwash. According to Stamp, Morton pulled Stern from the couch, spun him around and shot him. Stamp stated that Stern was unarmed and had no chance of escape. Morton maintained his version of events until his death and successfully sued several publishers who claimed he had killed Stern unlawfully. Menachem Begin, who later wrote about the incident in his book The Revolt, wanted to fight the case in court, but the British publisher settled without consulting him. Lehi attempted to take revenge by trying to eliminate Morton at least 3 times in subsequent years, but failed each time. Stern was buried in a small cemetery in Nakalat Yitzchak, in what is today Givatayim. The funeral was tiny, attended only by close family under heavy British surveillance. British authorities hoped Lehi members would appear to pay respect, making them easier to capture, but Lehi fighters stayed away. The British believed that Stern's death would destroy Lehi entirely. They had arrested or killed most of the leadership and assumed that without their charismatic founder, the remaining members would surrender or fade away. But they had fundamentally misunderstood the movement Stern had created. Within weeks, 3 of Stern's surviving lieutenants established a new command structure. Yitzhak Shamir, who would later become Prime Minister of Israel, took charge of operations. Nathan Yellin Moore handled political strategy. Israel Eldad became the group's ideological voice. This triumvirate transformed Lehi from a personality-driven movement centered on Stern into a more organized force. The group also shifted its ideology. Lehi developed a complex political philosophy that combined extreme nationalism with elements of what they called national Bolshevism, looking to the Soviet Union rather than Nazi Germany. This ideological flexibility revealed Lehi's fundamental principle. They would ally with any power that might help them fight Britain and establish a Jewish state. Lehi continued operations throughout World War II and after. In November 1944, the group carried out one of its most notorious acts when members shot and killed Lord Moyne, the British minister-resident in the Middle East, in Cairo. In September 1948, after Israeli independence, Lehi members killed Count Volker Bernadotte, the UN mediator in Palestine, because they opposed his peace proposals. The Israeli government declared Lehi a terrorist organization and arrested about 200 members, but a general amnesty was granted just before the first Israeli elections in January 1949. Many Lehi members were integrated into Israeli society and some achieved prominent positions. For years after Israeli independence, Lehi remained controversial. The mainstream establishment had condemned Stern during the Mandate period and continued to view his followers with suspicion. The killing of Bernadotte had embarrassed the new state internationally, but this began to change in the 1970s, driven by shifts in Israeli politics and the rise of the nationalist right. The strangest aspect of this story is how Israel has remembered Avraham Stern and Lehi in the decades since independence. In 1978, the Israeli Postal Service issued a stamp commemorating him. Streets named Avraham Stern can be found in cities across Israel, and the town of Kochav Yair was established and named after Stern's underground alias. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu even named his firstborn son, Yair. The apartment where Stern was killed became the Lehi Museum, where his life and activities are celebrated and educational events are held for students. Every year on the anniversary of his death, commemorations draw government officials, former Lehi members, and increasing numbers of young people who see Stern as a heroic figure who gave his life for Jewish independence. The transformation from controversial militant to national hero reflects broader changes in Israeli political culture after Menachem Begin was elected prime minister in 1977. He made the rehabilitation of the pre-state underground movements a priority because he believed that groups like Irgun and Lehi had been instrumental in forcing Britain to leave Palestine. This rehabilitation extended even to the Nazi proposal, with some defenders arguing that Stern's actions came from desperate commitment to saving Jews and creating a state. They framed his Nazi contacts as tragic miscalculation and emphasized that the proposal was rejected and came before the full horror of the Holocaust was known. But this rehabilitation ignores critical historical fact. Even in 1940 and 1941, the Nazi persecution of Jews was well documented and widely known. Kristallnacht had occurred in 1938, and Jews in Germany and occupied Poland faced systematic violence and forced relocation into ghettos. The idea that Stern could view Nazi Germany as merely wanting Jewish emigration required willful blindness. The distinction between enemies of the Jewish people and Jew haters was just word games that allowed Stern to justify collaborating with a regime already persecuting millions of Jews. The proposal to create a totalitarian Jewish state, bound by a treaty with the German Reich, reveals how far Stern was willing to go. He was offering to create a Jewish state as a client of Nazi Germany, organized on authoritarian principles and aligned with Hitler's new European order. Lehi documents from this period used language that emphasized Jewish strength and Arab weakness. while Israel Eldad, one of Lehi's intellectual leaders, wrote that it is not Hitler who is the hater of the kingdom of Israel and the return to Zion. It is not Hitler who subjects us to the cruel fate of falling a second and a third time into Hitler's hands, but the British. This ideology created a moral blindness that allowed Stern to pursue Nazi alliance even as evidence mounted that Hitler's regime was a deadly threat to all Jews. Germany never responded to the proposal, but this doesn't change the moral calculation. Stern was willing to collaborate and made concrete proposals that would have aligned a Jewish underground movement with Nazi Germany. The transformation of Stern's reputation reflects the complex way nations build their founding stories. Every nation selectively remembers its founding figures by emphasizing heroic narratives while downplaying uncomfortable contradictions. Israel's choice to honor Stern despite the Nazi proposal reveals how states manage morally complex histories when incorporating diverse resistance movements into national mythology. The argument becomes that Stern's commitment to Jewish statehood deserves recognition because the state he fought to create came into being and has provided a haven for Jews. But historical honesty requires acknowledging that Stern's Nazi proposal represented a profound moral failure that can't be excused by desperation. Other Zionist leaders facing the same circumstances rejected collaboration with Nazi Germany as fundamentally incompatible with Jewish values. The Haganah fought Britain politically while supporting Britain militarily against the Nazis. The Jewish Brigade helped liberate concentration camps. These groups opposed British policy in Palestine without seeking alliance with a regime persecuting Jews across Europe. Stern's path was different. He chose tactical advantage over moral principle and convinced himself that a Jewish state aligned with Nazi Germany was preferable to no Jewish state at all. Germany's decision to ignore his offer stemmed from the Nazis finding no value in it, not from Stern withdrawing the proposal. The episode stands as a cautionary tale about how commitment to a cause can lead to moral catastrophe when separated from basic ethics. The historical record shows that in January 1941, while Jews across Europe faced increasing persecution under Nazi occupation, a Jewish underground leader sent a representative to meet with German officials and propose an alliance. The proposal offered Jewish cooperation in fighting Britain in exchange for German support for a Jewish state organized on totalitarian principles. Germany never responded. Stern was killed by British police in February 1942, but the documentary evidence remains, preserved in the Ankara Document and confirmed by multiple historical sources. It demonstrates how desperation and ideological extremism can lead even those fighting for liberation to contemplate alliances that betray fundamental moral principles and the very people they claim to represent.